It wasn't because I had heard that it would help the onions grow. It wasn't because that's what everybody is doing. It wasn't because I wanted green onion top pesto or anything like that. Hey garden friends, welcome back to Not Quite Homesteading, ESK Garden. Today I'm in the garden and guess what y'all, the time has finally come for me to harvest my onions. I'm so excited because one, I get my bed space back after like 7 months of growing onions. Well, I start to get it back, but I'm also excited because I actually had some pretty good success with growing onions in my first years. We just had like a severe kind of like rainstorm, and I feel like maybe we got parts of like the nor'easter that was going on up north, but it's been a few days. The onions have had an opportunity to dry out, and I want to get them out because we're supposed to get some rain tomorrow. So I want to have them out and ready. They've fallen over, and I don't want to risk rotting my onions. So let's go ahead and jump right into this. I am so excited, and I'm so excited to bring you guys along. So today we're only harvesting the red onions. You guys can see that the onions have fallen over quite a bit. You know, I don't remember, I think I put these in November. I planted them from seed in November, so it is June. I grow short date onions because of my latitude here, and you know, I was really concerned at first that these were not going to do anything, but they surprised me kind of like in the last like month or so, and they started bulbing like really quickly. So I will share a couple of tips too at the end of the video of the things that I did and some of the things that I think I learned about growing onions compared to some of the usual information that's out there for farmers. But let's go ahead and get these out. Now I have harvested some of these onions already just to use and cook with. Wow. Just to use and cook with, and they weren't fully red on the inside, so I don't know if that's just the variety, but of course the outside is red. It's possible they weren't fully ready either, but we're gonna go ahead and get them out anyhow. Oh, I think they are okay at this point. So I can see that they still are a little wet, you know, where they were kind of bulbing together, but that's okay. I don't want to have to leave them in here another like, you know, week and a half just for them to fully dry out. But it's been pretty dry. I have not watered since we had that rain, so I think they're okay. So you guys can see we have some really small ones too. Some of them, not all of them, did really well, but you know, they started to bulb. I think some of them just weren't getting enough water where they were located in the bed, but that's okay. Those will come in handy for some things. Ooh, but they are stuck in here, boy. Oh, I don't want to break them. I think I'm pulling them at the wrong part. That might be why. If you're a new friend visiting the channel for the first time, welcome. My name is Ebony. I hope that you'll stay a while. If you're a gardening enthusiast, if you love a good gardening journey, or if you're a gardener yourself looking for community support, definitely join the family. Leave a comment down below. Let's engage and have some fun around this gardening thing. So I think this one was a little bit more ready than some of these, and for the most part, so I have a nice exciting surprise that I'll share with y'all in a different video, but for the most part, I think as far as preservation for these onions go, I'm probably going to do them in the freezer and or in some form that is not fresh storage. I will save a few, but red onions, they don't store very long anyway, so I want to do what I can to preserve them as long as possible. So I'm not worried 100% that some of them are not fully dry or not as dry as they could or should be, but I'm still going to be able to use them. None of them are going to go to waste, and the way I'm preserving them, I'll be fine. All right, so this is the last little bit of it, y'all, and you can see I got probably about as many like small or, you know, medium-sized onions as I did like normal sized ones. So it wasn't a perfect trial, but we definitely got a lot of onions nonetheless. So let's talk about what I did. All right, y'all, so let's talk about what I did. For one of the setbacks that I think I had, and this is a setback and why I believe a good portion of the onions didn't actually bulk to size, that was planting the onions late. So in my zone, South Carolina, coastal South Carolina, zone 8B, we are supposed to plant our onions in October. And I was about a month, maybe even a month and a half late with my initial planting. That was because the bed wasn't ready. I don't know if I had the seeds. I can't remember. I think vaguely remembering that I didn't have my seeds until November. But that was one thing that did set me back. The other thing is, because I was working with very limited space, what I did was I planted all of my onions in that bed, and we could see that, you know, it was obviously overcrowded. I worked to thin them throughout, but definitely did not thin them well enough. There were some pockets of space where we could have definitely thinned some more onions and probably gotten bigger bulbs off some of them. The third thing was, because the bed was overcrowded, you had onions that basically were kind of like tucked in corners. They weren't getting enough water. The water wasn't either reaching there, or maybe the sun wasn't reaching there. So those are three things that I observed in what I could have done a lot better to kickstart growing my onions. What I did that I think ended up helping me be successful after thinking that my onions were not going to bulb at all. So in the beginning, I packed my beds with nitrogen. I used a lot of blood meal. Now, I was not using liquid fertilizers in the early parts of when I started the garden. And that was really because, one, I didn't know enough about them. Two, you know, limited resources with building out a garden. You know, I purchased what I felt like could work in that time, but would also, you know, have lasting power. I dressed the beds with black cow before I planted anything in them, and this was in the early stages. I also added lots of blood meal, and then I also added garden tone. I believe those are the three fertilizers that went into the bed before the onions did. As far as refertilizing, I added bone meal, probably in twice the ratio of what was recommended by the manufacturer, in order to boost the plants. The thing I've learned about onions, and this is even just from growing like bunching onions, onions love nitrogen, alliums love nitrogen, and they love lots and lots of water. So I would go in every first of the month, and I would actually dress the bed with blood meal. Some months I did do the recommended, which is about a third a cup for that 4x4, you know, 16 square foot space. And some months I maybe doubled it up just if I felt like the plants needed it. So that's what I was doing, and we were getting, you know, really good green growth. Now, one of the things that happened to me is, because, and I believe this is because the onions were covered, because they were covered, my onion greens really suffered from blight, and I almost thought because of that I was not going to get onions that would bulb. And one of the things I was planning to do was to not cut my onion tops at all, because I wanted to see how the onions would grow if they were left to their natural vices. I ended up chopping back the greens of the onion tops. It wasn't because I had heard that it would help the onions grow. It wasn't because that's what everybody is doing. It wasn't because I wanted green onion top pesto or anything like that. It was simply because the greens were really, really diseased, and I felt like that was the only way I could remedy and get that diseasing under control. So the other thing that I did, which I believe also was where things started to pick up, I had my onions covered because I didn't want to deal with like any onion pest, thrips, or anything like that. Because of the climate that I live in, we stay wet all year round. In the summer, in the spring, it is hot and wet. In the fall and in the winter, it is cold and wet. And that just did not make up a good environment for my plants. So once I removed the netting, which was, the onions was a large part of why I removed the netting off of that bed. Once I removed the netting, what it did was it allowed the air to flow through a little more freely through the onions. And I think ultimately that allowed the greens to grow back a little bit better. You know, some of them still had some issues, but for the most part, I think I had remedied the issue. Once I did that and I saw the onions started bulbing, I was like, okay, so maybe the netting, you know, the lack of airflow, those were a number of the things that were contributing to some of the slower growth. Once I started to see the onions bulbing, I followed the general recommendations, which are, you know, make sure you give them water as well as stop fertilizing. I stopped fertilizing and nothing was happening. Now I had upped the water. I upped the water that I was giving just a little bit, and I was like, you know what? I said, something in my mind is telling me that, one, I need to go a little bit harder with the water, but two, that I probably need to keep fertilizing. And what I started doing was, and I was using bone meal before this as well. I want to say maybe around the early spring, you know, like maybe March or so, I started instituting the bone meal with the blood meal because we wanted good root development when it was time for the onions to start bulbing. I went back to adding the bone meal, but then what I also did, and I want to say it's roughly about 2 months ago, is where I started like instituting the liquid fertilizer into my garden. And once I did that, that's when I started to see a huge difference in how the onions were bulbing, but also how quickly they were bulbing. So what it kind of led me to believe is that I think a lot of the instruction that we get around best practices are when you're doing large scale farming. And these things may hold true if you are growing your onions and things in the ground, right? Because the nutrients are there, the roots can extend out, they can reach out for those nutrients, they're kind of like moving within the soil, you know, water shifts things around, and you know, that may very well be the case. You know, they have a lot more places to pull from when they're in the ground. When you're growing in a raised bed, your raised bed only has what you give it. And if it's not enough, then naturally your plants are going to suffer. So what I observed, and this is what I intend to practice going forward, you know, some people might disagree. If you're growing onions in a raised bed, you cannot stop fertilizing once the onions start bulbing. And the reality is as the onions are sucking out the nutrients, they're just being depleted. There's nothing going back in. The soil is breaking down as well in the process. You have other things feeding on the soil, and basically the nutrients are just running out. When you water, they're running out. So if you have struggled to grow onions in raised beds and you found that you're running into issues following the typical practices of I only fertilize in the beginning, when they start to bulb, shortly thereafter, which is I think most people say about 6 weeks after, and then I fertilize right before they start bulbing, and then that's it. If you're following that practice and it's worked for you, keep doing what you're doing. For people that have struggled to grow onions in raised beds, and that's what you've been following, I would encourage you to give a try to the method that I use to grow my onions, because what I realized is, just like anything else, you know, I'm growing in grow bags, I'm growing in raised beds, and you know, we have plants that are eating up a ton of nutrients. The only way they're going to get the nutrients is from me. So after I did that, from the point that I started re-fertilizing my onion bulbs, and I increased the water to probably about, you guys saw the gallon bucket in there, the gallon jug. I would do 2 of those every time I watered, and I would water anywhere from 2 to 3 times a week in the beds. Once I started doing that, I mean, immediately, it was within a week, I started to see onions bulbing and bulbing to large sizes. And then within a month, all of my onions had started to bulb and basically most of them were like pretty much at their like bulbing size. Like I said, the ones, not all of them were successful, but the ones that were around the edges of the beds, they had different struggles they were fighting. You know, if they were small to begin with, that means the onions that took off or had grown large leaves were already shading them out. They struggled to get like the full sun that they needed, and that's a different story, right? You know, I've learned what I need to do for next time as far as spacing. But the other thing I also realized, and I know a lot of people have questions and don't really understand like how the daylight hours work as far as like onions go. We just know, you know, we're in the South, we have to grow short day onions. We're Midland, we have to grow intermediate day onions, and what that really means. And I wish for the life of me I could find this article again, but I found this article that kind of gave one of the best explanations about how this really works as far as like onions grow. Onions start bulbing based on the number of daylight hours, right? So if you're in a short day climate like mine, that means when the days get to between 10 and 12 hours, the onions are going to start growing. However, it is also based on your latitude. And I am at a higher elevation than somebody way down in southern Texas that may see their onions start to bulb significantly at 10 hours. Where I am, my onions started bulbing when our days reached 13 hours in length. And that's what I noticed. They did a little bit, you know, around the 12-hour mark, but when it hit 13, that's when I saw the explosion in the bulbing. The article referenced also how short day onions tend to bulb as we get closer to the summer solstice. It referenced intermediate day onions typically bulbing once we pass the summer solstice, so once we pass that like longest day, and those onions typically are harvested around July or August. And long day onions actually bulb once we pass the summer solstice and as we get closer to the fall equinox. And you'll see that those onions would probably need to be pulled around like August, September, or right immediately after that equinox. So if I can find this article again, I will absolutely link it in my description box or, you know, one of the comment sections or something. But when I found that article and it explained it in that way, it actually changed what I thought about how to grow onions. So, and what I was up against and what I was really looking for. And one other piece as far as the length of day. So the length of day is not just about when the onions start bulbing. It also takes into consideration how the onions are going to leaf during the winter time. And short day onions, again, I believe they said they need something like maybe 8 to 10 hours of daylight in the winter months in order to grow the leaves that they need to be able to bulb when we get into those longer daylight hours. So if I can find it, I will absolutely share it. But those are the things that I noticed with growing. And when I started to shift kind of like what I was doing, considering that I am not growing in the ground, I'm not growing on a large scale, I don't have this lush fertile soil that, you know, has been here for years and years, I had to think about what that means, right? And what I needed to do in order to help the plants along. Now, I will give this tip as well. If you can do it, it's not always practical, it's not always an option, and I understand that it wasn't an option for me growing my onions this season. But if you can do it, I do believe that things like onions that need, you know, rich soil to be able to grow in are better grown in soil that has had plants grown in it before. This was a completely new bed, so I was starting from, you know, ground zero, and it took me, you know, almost to the near end of the onion life to really kind of think about this in the way that I started thinking about it. And, you know, that's how I was able to save my onions. So I drew this conclusion on some of my struggles with growing beets as well, and how my beets grew when I grew them in new soil versus when I grew them in soil that had cultivated like life and microbiology. So that's just a tip for you guys if you weren't aware of that. But I hope that you guys found this video helpful. I am so excited that I was able to do this in my first year of growing. And if you have, if you've had success, I am so happy for you. If you are someone that has struggled growing onions, it is okay. There is always this year coming. Try some of the tips that I gave and see if they work for you. Maybe I'll consider doing something where we can kind of all like partner together and grow together and, you know, follow some of the same growing techniques and see, you know, how they fare in maybe different climates and different soils using the same technique. But I appreciate you guys for spending time with me today in the garden. As always, friends, let's keep learning, sowing, and growing together.